Hello crafty friends, it's Jess from jesscrafts.com, and today I'm here with another 6x6 paper pad tutorial, but today I'm going to be using the P13 Christmas Treats paper pad. This was the paper pad that most people were interested in seeing when I recently shared a paper pad haul, so it's going to be the first one that I've made a video for. As you can see, there are some cut apart sheets in this paper pad, so I will be cutting those apart and using them on a few of the cards, or actually a lot of the cards. And also at the beginning and end of the pad on the back cover, if you look on the inside, you see that there's all these images that could be die cut. Oh, sorry, it can't be die cut because that means that you would need coordinating dies, but they could be cut out and then used as elements on the card. And rather than trimming them by hand, which I think would be quite time consuming, I am going to use my scan and cut to cut them. I mentioned that I wanted to try to do this, and some people said they were curious to see if it would work. So I actually included a little bit of my process of getting the scan and cut to cut these in the video in case that's helpful. And I will just try to share my general knowledge of how I got it to cut and how I use my scan and cut. So when I'm using my scan and cut, I almost always tape down the paper that I'm working with. In this case, this is quite a large piece, and so I'm going to tape down all of the corners and in the center of most of the sides. However, I am careful to make sure that where I'm placing the tape is far enough away from the images that it doesn't really interfere. It can be a little bit tricky to find a spot to do that if your paper is really full. Usually it's not a problem when I'm stamping because I can kind of keep that in mind as I place my stamps. So once that's all secure, and in theory you don't need to put down tape if you have a really clean new mat, but I just find they lose their stickiness really quickly, and rather than constantly using spray adhesive to restick my mat, taping works for me. I use the color setting, and you can increase the number of colors in order to help it to sort of see better what the images are. Sorry, a little bit of shaking there. It was hard to use my tripod and show you that, but basically I also added a border around it. And by scanning in color versus black and white, I'm able to get better results. When I am scanning colored in stamps, often black is the best because then it kind of focuses on the outline of the images. But in this case, there are no black lines in the outlines of the images, and so scanning in color is quite necessary. My cut speed is 3, and my cut pressure is also 3. I have never found an occasion to increase the cut speed over 3. In fact, I find that if you are increasing the cut speed, it's more likely that there will be tearing of the paper or the paper will come off the mat. I find that the slowest cut speed is best. Now this is sped up, but I think there are some instances with even thinner ones where you would slow down the cut speed. However, getting back to this particular instance, I did find that it did an okay job. I think overall it did a good job of finding all of the pieces and cutting them out. There were a few hiccups. Sometimes when an image was particularly delicate, it made mistakes. Also, and I expected this, but it was recognizing the pieces of yellow tape as images, which makes sense. The computer doesn't know that, that's a car and that's just a piece of tape, for instance. The tape that I use to tape it down is Frog Tape Delicate Surface Painter's Tape. It's just something that I bought many years ago and felt success with, and I haven't run out, so I've never looked into another tape that's similar. I use it to tape down die cuts and also in my scan and cut, and as you see, when I was finished with the tape, I did place it on the side of the mat, on the non-sticky part of the mat, and that's basically just to save it, so the next time that I go to cut something out, I can tape it down as well. Using the little spatula tool to scrape off any of the images, you can see here that it messed up a few images. Like those mittens, the string between the mittens is really thin and delicate and hard to pick up because it's yellow. So it did mess those up, and I would basically consider the mittens not usable because of how it cut them. However, for me, it was still a success. I was still happy. I would rather have the scan and cut most of the images beautifully than have to fussy cut them all myself, because I think the scan and cut's going to do a better job than me. It's going to save me a lot of time. I actually have a bit of a shoulder injury or soreness that can be agitated by different crafting things, including cutting out small images. So that's why, to me, the scan and cut is such a time saver. To get started with my paper pad, my cards, I am going to be adding in some gray cardstock and some craft cardstock. I am using cardstock that was purchased at Michael's. It's 110-pound cardstock. It's maybe not the top quality or doesn't have the texture that some other cardstocks out there have, but for my purposes, I think it works well. I don't usually use it except for as like mats, like, a little bit of an outline around an image, and therefore I don't need the top quality cardstock. I'm going to pull in 1 sentiment and use it across all of the cards. That was mostly just because it's easier for me to not have to keep pulling out new sentiments. So I encourage you to do what appeals to you best. There are a lot of sentiments on these images, but a few I didn't really think made sense, and then a few needed sentiments. So that one said, "Baby, it's cold outside." There's another one that says "Christmas tree," and those I wanted to cover up. But then there's also "Merry Christmas." I think that one works well. Didn't feel a need to cover it up. What you're going to see me often do is make a card, or like kind of design a card, I guess I want to say, and then take all the pieces and put them in a plastic bag. And even if you don't do that on screen, that's what I'm always doing. That's because I want to be able to finish assembling the cards away from my craft desk. I find that it's not always easy to get to my craft desk and spend as much time as I want crafting. But if I want to get more done, I can find 5 minutes here and there while doing various tasks, and I can assemble a card. Or I can spend time with my family while working on cards, if all I'm doing is just gluing things and I don't need to bring a lot of supplies down. So that's kind of my logic there. I believe I mentioned already, but there are 4 of each sheet in this particular paper pad, which means that I'm going to choose to make 4 of each card design. I have 10 card designs, 4 of each, 40 cards. Really was happy with that for a Christmas paper pad, because I like to have a lot of Christmas cards so that I can send them to people, but also to donate them to various organizations and bring a little cheer at this time of year. I feel like there are some extra card drives around Christmas time. And I will leave you a link in the video description to my card drive resources page. Because I'm using gray cardstock sometimes and craft cardstock sometimes, I decided to pull out a gray ink and a brown ink for the sentiment and use whichever one coordinated. So I'm using Walnut Lawn Fawn ink for the brown, and Hero Arts charcoal. It doesn't really matter. Pick, whatever gray and brown ink you have. It just happens to be the colors that I'm using. And so here, when I want a sentiment with the craft cardstock, I'll pull the brown ink in. And then the same with the gray. When I am working with these first few sheets, like basically when I'm cutting up each of the designs for the first time, I'm considering that they have a lot of these larger, beautiful images on the 6x6 paper pads, or 6x6 sheets, but because I'm making smaller cards, I can't use everything. So I couldn't use both the deer in the background and the other side, which had a little like chair vignette. So I'm kind of selecting like what piece of it do I like the best. Here, I thought the car was really cool at the bottom, but there also are a lot of cars in the cut aparts that I cut at the beginning of the video. So I knew I'd be able to use that image again. And then this, beautiful floral or image with the banner, I thought it actually suited this Merry Christmas cut apart. I am also trying to use a lot of the cut aparts so that as I get later in the video, I can also use some of the die cuts. But with the nature of this paper pad, it having the cut aparts and then the repeated sheets, there wasn't a lot of extra paper or design. So if I used one cut apart and one sheet of paper, I think there was actually more cut aparts than there were like different patterns. So in this case, I decided to use 3 cut aparts on one sheet, and I'm covering where it says Christmas tree with my sentiment. I think either the brown or the gray would have worked well here. I just happened to, I think, have more cardstock scraps of gray at the particular moment, and then I cut it into a little banner shape. A lot of times I die cut banners as well, but in that case I literally just took my scissors and cut it. The other thing that I'm trying to do right now is think about how to use some smaller scraps. I do have larger scraps that I know I can still work with going forward, because those initial cards, I cut all the papers to 3.5, which left a 2.5 by 6 inch strip. These strips here are what's left from the 3.5. So I cut it to 3.5, but then I cut it down to 4 3/4. So it left a little strip that's also 3.5 wide. And that allows me to have a somewhat substantial scrap, like it was big enough to be an element on a card. One thing that I hesitated on with this particular paper pad is I knew there was one paper that definitely wasn't going to be able to be double-sided to me, because it had the Advent calendar on the back, like all the Advent numbers. And so I knew I would only have to be able to use one side of it, but generally this paper pad, both sides were pretty usable. There were a couple of sheets of paper where I really liked one side more than the other, and knowing that some of them had those really large designs like the deer or the flowers with the banner that also had the car on it, like those really bold ones, knowing that there was a back that was generally a little bit more tame, made me feel like I would be able to get some good use out of this paper pad, but I might have to make certain creative decisions to try to work with it. So this is an example of it, this card. One of the reasons I pulled in cardstock, which I don't normally do, there are a lot of crafty YouTubers who make videos with 6x6 paper pads or card kits that include pattern paper. In particular, I know that one of the first people I knew who did 6x6 paper pads was Christy Marcotte. I believe that's how you say her name. I apologize if I said it wrong. I think she's very talented. She does many 6x6 paper pad tutorials and many other videos. Definitely check her out, although I'm sure if you're watching this video, you've heard of her too. But I don't always do the mats, and she does, and I think they look fabulous. However, this paper pad, because the designs were a little bit more delicate and the color palette was very light, a lot of the backgrounds aren't very colorful. There's a lot of white. And so if I layer a pattern paper with a lot of white in the background on another pattern paper with a lot of white in the background, I think they would just sort of fade into each other. Having the cardstock behind it breaks things up a bit, makes them stand out a little bit more. However, it's definitely more time consuming. When I use a Doodlebug paper pad, which is, I have many Doodlebug tutorials on my channel, the bolder designs and the lack of white space, often the backgrounds are colorful. I think they break themselves up a little bit easier, and I don't feel like there's as much of a need for these matte layers. Building up all these layers with these matte cardstocks does mean that things can get a little lumpy bumpy, in the sense of if you're putting some paper over a cardstock and paper layer, especially because these are 110-pound cardstocks, nice thick cardstocks, it can leave a little bit of a bump where you're placing, like, half of the next layer might be on top of the pattern paper and the other half is just right to the card base. It's just thick enough to be noticeable. And so what I've seen others do, and in particular, again, I'm going to call out Christy because she's brilliant, is she will take a scrap of cardstock and she will add it behind the part that's going to touch the card base so that everything's a little bit more even. I think that's a really great idea when you're working with this many layers. And so as I assemble this card, I often don't spend this much time on a single card, but I just wanted to kind of pause briefly and point out what I'm doing. I know people do 6x6 paper pad tutorials in many different ways. If you're familiar with my method, it's to give you some design thoughts as I'm creating and other little tips. But if you want to know exactly what I'm doing with each card, there's a blog link in the video description where you can see the measurements of every single card and a still picture of every card, so that if you want to know exactly what I was doing or recreating or to recreate one, you could get the measurements there. So that's where I'm taking that little piece of cardstock and I'm putting it on the side that's not on the pattern paper. And it just evens things out a bit, makes everything look just a little bit more smooth. I do use my ATG, my Scotch adhesive gun, a lot, but sometimes I also pull in my Barely Arts glue. I've been very happy with my ATG over the years, but it is a little cumbersome at times. And the Barely Arts glue is, like, which I'm using right here, is very strong and does not warp my paper. I used multimedia matte here and there for a number of years, but it always left everything kind of bumpy. And it may have been that I was using too much, but it was really hard to get a fine line without adding caps that were then clogging. Anyway, point being, if you're looking for a good liquid glue, I'm finally happy with a liquid glue, and it's the Barely Arts glue. I know a lot of people, I've seen, different people working with Barely Arts to promote the glue, and no problem with that, but I don't, just so you know. Like, I'm not affiliated with them or anything. I just genuinely, I purchased the glue and liked it. So I'm going to move on to working with the die cuts at this point. I've used up all of the cut aparts. The thing with the die cuts, though, is I'm making 4 of each card, but there's not 4 of each die cut. In fact, a lot of the die cuts are just one-ofs. But the cars, there are 4 cars that are facing either front or back, and then I believe 2 cars that are facing to the side. So even though I really liked the deer and wanted to use him on something, in order to create a bunch of cards that were similar, it was actually easier to use these cars. I pulled in 1 car and then 1 flower because there was a bunch of, I think they actually all were poinsettias for this card, because there are a bunch of poinsettias in the paper pad. They're a bunch of different sizes though, and also there were this other red flower, but there was plenty of that, so I knew I could use that as a repeating element as well as the cars, because those were the ones that were most often repeated. There are a number of leaves and evergreen boughs that are repeated. There's like 2 lollipops and 2 gingerbread men. So there are some repetition, but those are also some smaller elements, and I wanted them to be large enough. So I'm going to use the 4 cars that are all facing either the back or the front. So they're all about the same size, the poinsettia, and then add in the sentiment for this card. But that's kind of my logic. I think if you weren't trying to create multiples, then just, use whichever ones strike your fancy the most. As I was getting towards the end, I believe this is going to be the last card. I didn't have a lot left. I did have this cookie paper, which was one of my favorite papers in the paper pad. That and the sweater paper. I think the sweater paper was my favorite, but in general, beautiful papers. One of the gingerbread papers I did originally cut wrong, so my strip of gingerbread paper on one of my cards isn't going to be as wide. But for the photos and everything else, I'm going to show you it done the right way, as in not with my mistake. I took all the scraps, I took a few of the scraps that I had left, and I just matted them, and then I figured I would just kind of play with them, because I knew at this point that I was going to want to mat everything. Earlier in the video, like when I did the card with the green strip, that doesn't have a cardstock mat, and so I wasn't sure if I was going to do it for everything, but as I got towards the end, I realized, especially with using these smaller strips of paper, really breaking them up and adding that mat was pretty necessary. I'm going to look at the die cuts and kind of create a few little vignettes, and then I'm going to put them off to the right there. So I created like one with a flower and 2 leaves, and then a flower and 2 pine boughs. I think that's what they're called. Please tell me if there's another word for it, but like the pine branches. Or the cars could work here. There's like a coffee cup with the gingerbread, and the lollipops, kind of like a vignette of the different little sweet elements to go with the cookie background. So that was going to be my last design. Here is one of each of the 10 cards that I created. Again, the measurements for each of these and still pictures for each of these will be over on my blog. At this point, I have very little left. I have a handful of scraps and then a bunch of the die cuts, just because they are kind of small. So, and because there were so many things that I could do on the front of cards with those cut apart sheets, that I had quite a few die cuts left. However, I actually think that's great because they're going to be perfect for the inside of cards, so that these cards, which are a little bit more simple in their design at times, will have something fun peeking out on the inside. So I'm going to take all those little pattern paper strips that are left over, and I'm going to place them in the bottom left-hand corner, and sometimes I'm going to pair them with a die cut, or I'll just leave a little pattern paper there just to, well, two reasons. To use it up. Like, what am I going to save all these little scraps for? But also because I really do think it adds a nice little touch to the inside of the card. I'm going to kind of think about how it coordinates with the outside of the card. So like this deer die cut, I put in the card that already has the deer. So that is it for my video today. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you are interested in more crafting tutorials, especially 6x6 paper pad tutorials, please subscribe to my channel because I do share a fair amount of those. And at the end of the video, I will share you a link to some other 6x6 paper pad tutorials if that's what you're interested in. I really appreciate you taking the time to watch today, and I will leave you links to the products used in the video description below, as well as the other resources that I mentioned. Please leave me a comment letting me know what your favorite card is, or letting me know what kinds of paper pads you'd like to see in the future. Have an awesome day.